year is 1683. Europe stands on the edge of annihilation. The city of Vienna, the gateway to Western Christendom, is surrounded by the largest army the Ottoman Empire has ever assembled. 200,000 warriors, armed with the most advanced artillery of the age, prepare for the final assault. Inside the crumbling walls, 15,000 exhausted defenders know that if Vienna falls, nothing will stop the Islamic conquest of Europe. But hidden in the mountains to the north, a secret weapon is assembling, a force so devastating, so terrifying, that when it finally strikes, it will change the course of world history in a single afternoon. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of how one cavalry charge destroyed an empire's dreams and saved Western civilization from extinction. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must go back several decades before the siege. The Ottoman Empire in the 17th century was a colossus that bestrode 3 continents. From the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the steppes of Ukraine to the deserts of North Africa, the green banner of Islam flew triumphant. The sultans in Constantinople ruled over 70 million subjects, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and controlled trade routes that made them fabulously wealthy. Every generation of Ottoman rulers had expanded the empire's borders. Every sultan dreamed of surpassing his predecessors in glory and conquest. And there was one prize that had eluded them all: Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, sitting astride the Danube River like a jewel, represented far more than just another city to be conquered. Vienna was the gateway. If the Ottomans could take Vienna, the road to Germany would lie open. France, the Italian states, all of Western Europe would be vulnerable. The dream of establishing Islamic rule from Constantinople to the Atlantic Ocean, a dream that had burned in Ottoman hearts since the days of Mehmed the Conqueror, would finally be within reach. But the Ottomans had tried before and failed. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent himself had laid siege to Vienna with a massive army. He had bombarded the walls, sent wave after wave of janissaries against the fortifications, and yet the city held. Winter came early that year, and Suleiman was forced to retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and his dream of European conquest unfulfilled. For over a century afterward, the frontier between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires had remained relatively stable, a testament to mutual exhaustion and the difficulty of projecting power over such vast distances. But by the 1680s, the situation had changed. A new generation of ambitious Ottoman leaders believed the time had come to finish what Suleiman had started. Sultan Mehmed IV, though young and inexperienced, was surrounded by advisors who whispered of glory and conquest. And chief among these was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. Kara Mustafa was a complex and ultimately tragic figure. Born into slavery, he had risen through the Ottoman system through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and political acumen. By 1681, he had achieved supreme power, answerable only to the Sultan himself. But with power came an insatiable hunger for more wealth, more glory, more territory to govern. And Kara Mustafa saw Vienna as the key to satisfying that hunger.
In 1681, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Hungary, which lay between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, erupted in revolt against Habsburg rule. Hungarian nobles, Protestant and resentful of Catholic Austrian domination, invited the Ottomans to intervene. It was the excuse Kara Mustafa had been waiting for. He convinced Sultan Mehmed that the time had come to launch the long-delayed campaign against Vienna. The Sultan gave his blessing, and Kara Mustafa began assembling the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded for a European campaign. The army that gathered in the spring of 1683 was truly awe-inspiring. At its core were the Janissaries, the elite infantry who had terrorized European armies for 2 centuries. These were not ordinary soldiers. Taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and raised in military barracks, the Janissaries were fanatically loyal to the Sultan and supremely skilled in warfare. They wore distinctive white felt caps, carried the latest matchlock muskets, and fought with a discipline that regular European infantry could rarely match. 20,000 Janissaries formed the iron backbone of the Ottoman army. Supporting them were the Sipahis, the heavy cavalry of the Ottoman Empire. These were Muslim knights, holders of fiefs granted in exchange for military service. Mounted on magnificent Arabian and Turkish horses, armed with composite bows that could shoot arrows 300 meters, curved sabers that could decapitate a man with a single stroke, and long lances for the charge, the Sipahis were formidable warriors. 40,000 of them answered the call to arms, their colorful banners and ornate armor creating a spectacular display as they assembled. But the army was far more than just Janissaries and Sipahis. From the Crimean Khanate came 20,000 Tatar horsemen, light cavalry renowned for their speed and ferocity. These warriors, descendants of the Mongol hordes that had once terrorized Europe, specialized in raiding and harassment. They would ride ahead of the main army, burning villages, seizing supplies, and spreading terror among the civilian population. From the Ottoman vassal states of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania came another 30,000 troops, a mixture of cavalry and infantry. And then there were the irregulars, the volunteers and adventurers who followed every major Ottoman campaign. Drawn by the promise of plunder and religious merit, these men swelled the army's ranks by tens of thousands more. When the final count was made, Kara Mustafa commanded somewhere between 170,000 and 200,000 men. The exact number is disputed by historians, but what is certain is that this was the largest Ottoman army ever to invade Europe. And this army was not just numerous, but technologically advanced. The Ottomans brought with them 300 pieces of artillery, including massive siege guns capable of hurling stone balls weighing 200 kilograms. These same guns had battered down the walls of Constantinople 2 centuries earlier. Now they would be turned against Vienna.
In March of 1683, this enormous force began its march northward from the Ottoman assembly point at Adrianople. It moved like a dark flood across the landscape, leaving devastation in its wake. Cities that resisted were sacked. Those that surrendered were looted anyway. The Ottoman advance was deliberately calculated to inspire terror, and it succeeded magnificently. Panic gripped the Habsburg Empire. Refugees fled westward with tales of atrocities. The roads were clogged with people abandoning their homes, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Emperor Leopold I, ruler of the Habsburg domains, watched the approaching catastrophe with growing despair. His empire was already beset by problems. To the west, France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, was aggressively expanding its borders at Habsburg expense. The German princes, nominally subjects of the Holy Roman Empire, which Leopold headed, were divided by religion and mutual suspicion. Many Protestant princes actively distrusted Catholic Austria and were reluctant to send aid. Leopold's own military forces were scattered, undermanned, and poorly equipped. He had perhaps 30,000 regular troops available, and most of those were tied down on other fronts. As the Ottoman army drew closer, Leopold faced an agonizing decision. Should he remain in Vienna to lead the defense personally, risking capture or death if the city fell? Or should he withdraw to safety and coordinate the relief effort from a distance? In early July, with the Ottomans only days away, Leopold made his choice. He fled Vienna, taking with him the imperial court, the treasury, and as many valuables as could be transported. The decision was militarily sensible, but politically catastrophic. To the people of Vienna, it looked like abandonment. Their emperor had deserted them in their hour of greatest need. Command of Vienna's defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starrenberg, a professional soldier in his late 30s. Starrenberg was an experienced officer who had fought in numerous campaigns, but nothing in his career had prepared him for what he now faced.
He had approximately 15,000 troops to defend a city surrounded by walls that were already in poor repair. The fortifications of Vienna had been built in the 16th century and were considered outdated by military standards of the 1680s. They were too low, too thin, and vulnerable to modern artillery. Starnberg knew he could not hope to repel a determined Ottoman assault indefinitely. His only chance was to hold out long enough for a relief army to arrive. But where would this relief army come from? On July 14, 1683, the Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Vienna. The sight must have been overwhelming. For miles in every direction, the landscape was covered with Ottoman tents, artillery parks, cavalry formations, and supply trains. Kara Mustafa established his headquarters in a luxurious silk pavilion and immediately began planning the siege. Unlike Sultan Suleiman in 1529, Kara Mustafa was in no hurry. He had arrived early in the campaign season, with ample time before winter. He would reduce Vienna methodically, using the full power of his artillery and engineering expertise.
The bombardment began on July 17th. 300 Ottoman guns opened fire simultaneously, and the walls of Vienna shook under the impact. Day and night, the cannons roared, firing stone and iron balls that smashed into the fortifications, pulverizing masonry and creating clouds of dust that hung over the city like a funeral shroud. But artillery alone would not be enough. The Ottomans were masters of siege warfare, and Kara Mustafa employed the full range of techniques available. Engineers began digging approach trenches, zigzagging lines that crept closer to the walls while providing cover for the attackers. Simultaneously, miners began tunneling under the fortifications. This mining was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the siege for Vienna's defenders. Deep underground, Ottoman sappers dug tunnels that extended beneath the walls. When a tunnel reached the right position, it would be packed with barrels of gunpowder and detonated. The explosion would create a breach in the wall through which assault troops could pour. Vienna's defenders tried to countermine, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman excavations, leading to savage underground battles fought in darkness with knives and pistols. But the Ottomans were relentless. Explosion after explosion rocked the walls. Entire sections collapsed into rubble. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The civilian population, which had swelled with refugees before the siege began, suffered terribly. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread through the crowded streets. The constant bombardment left no place safe. Buildings collapsed, burying families in rubble. Fires broke out and raged uncontrolled through wooden structures. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried, and the stench of decay filled the air. Every day brought new assaults. Ottoman janissaries would rush through the breaches in the walls, and brutal hand-to-hand combat would rage in the ruins. Starhemberg's men fought with desperate courage, knowing that if the city fell, no mercy would be shown. They repelled each attack, but at terrible cost. Casualties mounted inexorably. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The defenders were reaching the limits of endurance. And yet, even in this desperate situation, there was hope, because across Europe, a remarkable diplomatic effort was underway. Pope Innocent XI, viewing the siege as a crisis for all of Christendom, had launched a campaign to unite the fractious European states against the common Ottoman threat. This was no easy task. Catholic and Protestant states had been slaughtering each other for over a century in the wars of religion. France, the most powerful Catholic state, was actively hostile to the Habsburgs and secretly pleased to see Leopold in difficulty. The German princes were divided by religion, politics, and personal animosities. Many would have been content to let Vienna fall if it meant weakening the Habsburg emperor.
But Pope Innocent was a masterful diplomat. He offered money from the papal treasury to princes who would send troops. He granted special religious dispensations. He framed the conflict not as a political dispute, but as a holy war, a crusade to defend Christendom against the infidel. Slowly, painfully, his message began to resonate. The first major ruler to respond was John III Sobieski, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania.
Sobieski was one of the most remarkable figures of the 17th century. Born into the Polish warrior nobility, he had spent his entire adult life fighting. Against Cossacks in Ukraine, against Tatars in the steppes, against Ottomans in Moldavia, he had fought and won dozens of battles. He was a brilliant tactician, a charismatic leader, and utterly fearless in combat. When the call came from Vienna, Sobieski saw it not merely as a request for help, but as an opportunity for immortal glory. Poland in 1683 was a curious state. Officially known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was a vast territory, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea steppes. But it was also politically chaotic. The Polish monarchy was elective, chosen by an assembly of nobles, and the king's power was severely constrained by those same nobles who jealously guarded their privileges. Any major decision required the consent of the noble assembly, the Sejm, where any single noble could veto any legislation through the infamous liberum veto. This system made Poland almost ungovernable and would eventually lead to the country's partition and disappearance from the map. But in the short term, it produced one remarkable advantage. The Polish nobility was a warrior caste. Every noble was trained from boyhood in the arts of war. Service in the cavalry was considered the highest honor, and Poland's cavalry was the finest in Europe. At the heart of that cavalry were the winged Hussars, the ultimate evolution of the mounted knight. To understand what made the Hussars so formidable, we need to examine their development over the preceding 2 centuries. In the 15th century, Poland found itself caught between powerful enemies. To the west were the German Teutonic Knights. To the east and south were the vast expanses of the Ukrainian steppes, from which Tatar raiders emerged regularly to burn, kill, and enslave. Traditional Western European heavy cavalry, knights in full plate armor on massive war horses, proved ineffective against the swift Tatar horsemen who would simply evade, surround, and overwhelm the slower European knights. The Poles adapted. They began to develop a new type of cavalry that combined the protection of European armor with the speed and maneuverability of Eastern horse archers. Over generations, this synthesis produced the Hussars. By the 1680s, a fully equipped winged Hussar was an awe-inspiring sight. He wore a combination of Eastern and Western armor. A steel breastplate protected the torso. Articulated arm guards covered the arms. A helmet, often ornate and topped with a tall crest, protected the head. But unlike Western knights who wore solid plate armor that weighed 60 to 70 kilograms, Hussar armor was lighter and more flexible. It weighed perhaps 20 to 30 kilograms, carefully crafted to provide maximum protection with minimum weight. Over this armor, the Hussar wore exotic animal skins. Leopard, tiger, or panther pelts were draped over the shoulders. This served multiple purposes. The skins provided some additional protection against sword cuts. They were also status symbols, indicating the warrior's wealth and prowess. But most importantly, they added to the psychological impact of the Hussars' appearance. Imagine seeing thousands of horsemen thundering toward you, each one seeming to be some hybrid of man and predatory cat.
But the most distinctive feature was the wings. Attached to the back of the saddle or to the rider's back through a special harness were wooden frames covered with eagle feathers. These wings stood nearly 2 meters tall when the Hussar was mounted. Their purpose has been debated by historians. Some sources suggest they were purely decorative, a way to make the Hussar appear larger and more intimidating. Others claim they had practical functions, such as deflecting arrows or lassos thrown by Tatar warriors. But the most significant purpose was almost certainly psychological and acoustic. When a hussar galloped, the wind passing through the feathers created an eerie whistling sound. When thousands of hussars charged together, this whistle became a roar, an unnatural noise that could be heard from miles and struck terror into the hearts of those who heard it. The hussars' primary weapon was the kopia, a lance of revolutionary design. Unlike Western lances, which were thick and heavy, meant to be couched firmly under the arm for a single devastating impact, the kopia was hollow. Constructed from two halves of wood glued together and reinforced with strips of metal, it was incredibly light for its length of 5 to 6 meters. This allowed the hussar to wield it in one hand, balancing it rather than couching it. The technique was to hold the lance loosely, allowing it to slide through the hand during impact, then withdraw and thrust again. A skilled hussar could kill multiple enemies in a single pass, thrusting the lance through one opponent, withdrawing it while still at full gallop, and immediately engaging the next target. When the lance inevitably broke, the hussar had backup weapons. At his side hung a szabla, a curved saber of extraordinary quality. Polish swordsmiths had perfected the art of creating blades that were both flexible and incredibly sharp. These sabers could bend 90 degrees without breaking, and were sharp enough to slice through flesh and bone with minimal effort. Each hussar also carried additional weapons, including pistols, a shorter saber, sometimes an axe or warhammer, making him a mobile arsenal capable of fighting in any circumstance. But equipment alone did not make the hussars invincible. Their true strength lay in training and discipline. Each hussar was a professional warrior who had trained from childhood. The sons of noble families began learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk. By age 10, they were practicing with weapons. By age 15, they were undergoing formal military training. By age 20, they were veteran warriors who had likely already seen combat. This lifetime of preparation produced soldiers of extraordinary skill. A hussar could control his horse with his knees alone, leaving both hands free to wield weapons. He could fire a pistol accurately at full gallop. He could couch and aim a 5-meter lance while thundering across uneven terrain. These skills, which sound impossible to modern ears, were the result of thousands of hours of practice. Moreover, hussars fought in formation, not as individuals. They trained together constantly, learning to maneuver as a unit. The basic hussar formation was a line, knee to knee, each man maintaining exact spacing with his neighbors. When ordered to charge, they would advance in successive waves. The first line would hit the enemy, penetrating and disrupting the enemy formation. Before the enemy could recover, the second wave would strike, widening the breach. Then the third and the fourth. Each successive impact drove deeper into the enemy formation, spreading chaos and panic. This wave technique was devastatingly effective and required extraordinary discipline. Horses naturally want to avoid collisions. Training them to charge directly into a mass of men and horses required years of work. Maintaining formation while galloping across uneven ground demanded perfect horsemanship. Coordinating multiple waves required clear command and instant obedience. The hussars had perfected all of this through decades of constant warfare on Europe's eastern frontiers. By mid-August of 1683, Sobieski had assembled his army and was marching south toward Vienna. He brought with him approximately 18,000 heavy cavalry, including 3,000 winged hussars from his own royal guard, and another 15,000 from the retinues of Polish nobles who had answered the call to arms. Supporting them were about 8,000 Polish infantry and several thousand Cossack light cavalry. It was a powerful force, but not nearly large enough to challenge the Ottoman army alone. However, Sobieski was not alone. Responding to Pope Innocent's appeals, several German princes had raised troops and were marching toward Vienna. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, brought an imperial army of about 11,000 men. This was the core of Leopold's military strength, professional soldiers who had been fighting France on the western frontiers. From Bavaria came Max Emanuel, bringing Bavarian regiments numbering about 11,000. From Saxony, from Franconia, from Swabia, smaller contingents arrived. In total, the relief force numbered somewhere between 65,000 and 76,000 men. It was still significantly outnumbered the Ottoman army, but it was united in purpose and led by competent commanders. The logistics of assembling this force were extraordinary. The various contingents were scattered across hundreds of kilometers. They had to coordinate their movements to rendezvous at the right time and place. They had to bring supplies, ammunition, and artillery over mountain roads. Sobieski, in particular, faced a grueling march. His army had to cross the Carpathian Mountains, dragging cannons and supply wagons over narrow mountain passes. It was a testament to his leadership and the discipline of his troops that they arrived on schedule, exhausted but ready to fight. By early September of 1683, Sobieski had gathered his army and was marching south toward Vienna. He brought with him approximately 18,000 heavy cavalry, including 3,000 winged hussars from his own royal guard and another 15,000 from the retinues of Polish nobles who had answered the call to arms. Supporting them were about 8,000 Polish infantry and several thousand Cossack light cavalry. It was a powerful force, but not nearly large enough to challenge the Ottoman army alone. However, Sobieski was not alone. Responding to Pope Innocent's appeals, several German princes had raised troops and were marching toward Vienna. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, brought an imperial army of about 11,000 men. This was the core of Leopold's military strength, professional soldiers who had been fighting France on the western frontiers. From Bavaria came Max Emanuel, bringing Bavarian regiments numbering about 11,000. From Saxony, from Franconia, from Swabia, smaller contingents arrived. In total, the relief force numbered somewhere between 65,000 and 76,000 men. It was still significantly outnumbered the Ottoman army, but it was united in purpose and led by competent commanders. The logistics of assembling this force were extraordinary. The various contingents were scattered across hundreds of kilometers. They had to coordinate their movements to rendezvous at the right time and place. They had to bring supplies, ammunition, and artillery over mountain roads. Sobieski, in particular, faced a grueling march. His army had to cross the Carpathian Mountains, dragging cannons and supply wagons over narrow mountain passes. It was a testament to his leadership and the discipline of his troops that they arrived on schedule, exhausted but ready to fight. By early September of 1683, Sobieski had gathered his army and was marching south toward Vienna. He brought with him approximately 18,000 heavy cavalry, including 3,000 winged hussars from his own royal guard and another 15,000 from the retinues of Polish nobles who had answered the call to arms. Supporting them were about 8,000 Polish infantry and several thousand Cossack light cavalry. It was a powerful force, but not nearly large enough to challenge the Ottoman army alone. However, Sobieski was not alone. Responding to Pope Innocent's appeals, several German princes had raised troops and were marching toward Vienna. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, brought an imperial army of about 11,000 men. This was the core of Leopold's military strength, professional soldiers who had been fighting France on the western frontiers. From Bavaria came Max Emanuel, bringing Bavarian regiments numbering about 11,000. From Saxony, from Franconia, from Swabia, smaller contingents arrived. In total, the relief force numbered somewhere between 65,000 and 76,000 men. It was still significantly outnumbered the Ottoman army, but it was united in purpose and led by competent commanders. The logistics of assembling this force were extraordinary. The various contingents were scattered across hundreds of kilometers. They had to coordinate their movements to rendezvous at the right time and place.
They had to bring supplies, ammunition, and artillery over mountain roads. Sobieski, in particular, faced a grueling march. His army had to cross the Carpathian Mountains, dragging cannons and supply wagons over narrow mountain passes. It was a testament to his leadership and the discipline of his troops that they arrived on schedule, exhausted but ready to fight. By early September of 1683, Sobieski had gathered his army and was marching south toward Vienna. He brought with him approximately 18,000 heavy...
Kara Mustafa faced a critical decision. The arrival of a relief army had been expected, but not a force this large. He had three options. First, he could lift a siege, withdraw his army, and offer battle on ground of his choosing. Second, he could leave a screening force to watch the relief army while continuing the siege, gambling that Vienna would fall before the relief force could intervene. Third, he could divide his army, maintaining the siege while sending a substantial force to confront the relieving army. Kara Mustafa chose the third option, and it was a fatal mistake. He underestimated the size and capability of the force arrayed against him. He believed his numerical superiority was so great that he could fight on two fronts simultaneously. And perhaps most crucially, he was driven by greed. The treasures of Vienna were so close. The plunder of the richest city in Central Europe would make him fabulously wealthy. He could not bear to abandon the prize when it seemed within reach. So, he divided his forces. On the night of September 11th, both armies prepared for battle. On the Christian side, the commanders held a war council. Duke Charles of Lorraine, as the senior imperial officer, technically held overall command, but he was wise enough to recognize that Sobieski was the superior general and had brought the largest and most powerful contingent. Command was tactfully shared, with Sobieski taking charge of the crucial right wing where the Polish forces were concentrated. The battle plan was straightforward. The army would descend from the Vienna woods and attack the Ottoman positions from the north, while Starhemberg's garrisons sallied from the city to pin down Ottoman forces on the southern side of the siege lines. The Germans and Austrians would form the center and left of the attacking line. The Poles would hold the right wing on the high ground of the Kahlenberg, one of the hills overlooking Vienna. Sobieski studied the terrain with the eye of a master tactician. The slope from Kahlenberg down to the Ottoman positions was nearly perfect for a cavalry charge down that slope. It was long, relatively gentle, and mostly clear of obstacles. Gravity would add tremendous speed and force to a mounted charge down that slope. The Ottomans were positioned on the low ground with the Danube River at their backs. If their line broke, they would have nowhere to retreat except into the river. The tactical situation was ideal, but Sobieski would have to time his charge perfectly. He needed to wait until the Ottoman reserves were committed, until the enemy line was fully engaged and unable to maneuver. Charging too early would allow the Ottomans to refuse their flank or bring up artillery. Charging too late might mean the German and Austrian forces in the center would be defeated before the Polish hammer could fall. It would require patience, nerve, and perfect judgment of the battle's flow. On the Ottoman side, Kara Mustafa was preparing to receive the attack, but he had made several errors that would prove catastrophic. First, much of his artillery was still positioned to bombard Vienna, not to face north toward the approaching relief army. Repositioning 300 cannons in the midst of a battle is extremely difficult, and many guns would never be brought to bear against the relieving force. Second, he had not properly scouted the terrain of the Kahlenberg Heights. He did not fully appreciate how vulnerable his left flank was to cavalry attack from that direction. Third, and most fatally, he did not grasp the true nature of the force massed on his left. He saw cavalry on the heights, but assumed they were ordinary horsemen, dangerous perhaps, but not decisively so. He had no conception of what the winged Hussars could do under ideal conditions. He was about to receive the most devastating lesson in cavalry warfare ever delivered. The dawn of September 12, 1683, broke cold and misty over Vienna. As the sun rose, burning away the morning fog, both armies could finally see each other clearly. The sight was awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure.
The Ottoman army, spread across the plains south and west of Vienna, seemed to cover the earth like a vast carpet of men, horses, and cannons. Their countless banners snapped in the wind, displaying the crescent moon of Islam, the Sultan's Tugra, and the personal emblems of dozens of commanders. The morning light glinted off thousands of helmets, gun barrels, and sword blades. It was a display of military power such as Europe had not seen in generations. Facing them, descending from the Vienna woods like an avalanche in slow motion, came the relief army. The Germans and Austrians in the center advanced in disciplined formations, their regimental flags identifying units from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and the Imperial army. Their infantry marched in tight blocks, pikes and muskets at the ready. Their cavalry rode in ordered squadrons. Artillery pieces were manhandled down the rough forest paths, crews struggling to position the guns where they could support the advance. It was an impressive force, professional and well-organized. But every eye, both Christian and Ottoman, kept returning to the right flank, to the Kahlenberg Heights where the Polish army stood. 18,000 horsemen were arrayed there, and they were like nothing else on the battlefield. The morning sun caught their armor and made them blaze like a forest of silver trees. The wings attached to their backs made each rider seem impossibly tall, almost gigantic. Animal pelts draped over their shoulders added to the barbaric magnificence of their appearance. Their lances, held vertical for now, created a forest of wooden shafts that swayed slightly in the breeze. And over all of this flew the banners of Poland, the white eagle on a red field, and the personal standards of the king and the great nobles. At the front of this magnificent host, mounted on a magnificent gray warhorse, sat John Sobieski, King of Poland, wearing gilded armor and carrying a saber that had drunk Ottoman blood in a dozen battles. He was 54 years old, an age considered elderly for a warrior in that era, but he sat his horse like a man half his age, and his eyes burned with the fierce joy of a man who knew he was about to make history. The battle began at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, though in the pre-dawn darkness it consisted mainly of artillery exchanges and skirmishing. As the sun climbed higher, the tempo increased. The German and Austrian forces in the center began their main advance, pushing against the Ottoman right and center. These were brutal, grinding infantry battles, lines of men firing muskets at point-blank range, then charging forward with pikes and swords when ammunition ran low. The Ottomans fought ferociously. The Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman infantry, held their ground with fanatical determination. They fired disciplined volleys, then countercharged with scimitars and daggers. The fighting surged back and forth across the same bloody ground, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Inside Vienna, Count Starhemberg heard the cannons to the north and knew the relief army had engaged. He immediately ordered a sortie. The gates of Vienna swung open, and several thousand of his remaining troops poured out, attacking the Ottoman siege lines from behind. This forced Kara Mustafa to commit reserves to contain the sally, reserves that he desperately needed elsewhere. The Ottomans now found themselves fighting on two fronts, exactly the situation they had hoped to avoid. But their numbers were still so great that they could manage it, at least for now. The siege lines held against Starhemberg's attack, and the center held against the German and Austrian assault. Count Kara Mustafa, observing the battle from his headquarters, began to feel cautiously optimistic. His forces were holding. If they could maintain their positions until nightfall, they could reorganize and continue the fight the next day. Superior numbers would eventually tell. But he had forgotten about the Poles on the Kahlenberg. Or rather, he had not forgotten them, but he had underestimated them catastrophically. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, Sobieski held his cavalry in reserve. He watched the battle unfold below with the patience of a master craftsman, waiting for exactly the right moment to make the crucial cut. His commanders grew restless. Several approached him, suggesting that the cavalry should charge to support the hard-pressed Germans in the center, but Sobieski refused. Not yet, he told them, not yet. He was waiting for something specific, and he would know it when he saw it.
Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he saw it.
The Ottoman center was fully committed. Their reserves had been pulled forward to shore up the line against the German attack. The Ottoman left flank, the part of their army directly below the Kallenberg, was beginning to waver under pressure from Austrian cavalry probing attacks. Most crucially, the Ottoman artillery on that flank was in disarray, many guns still facing Vienna, others being laboriously turned to face the new threat, but not yet in position to fire. The terrain was clear, the slope perfect, the enemy vulnerable. It was time. Sobieski gave a series of rapid orders. Couriers galloped along the Polish lines, carrying the king's commands to each unit. The cavalry began to move, forming into their attack formations. This was not a disorderly mass charge. The Hussars and supporting cavalry formed into clearly defined lines, each several hundred men wide, with careful spacing maintained between riders. The first line consisted of the elite winged Hussars, 3,000 of Poland's finest warriors. Behind them came the second line, another wave of heavy cavalry. Then the third line and the fourth, 18,000 horsemen in total, organized into 4 massive waves that would strike the enemy in succession. Sobieski rode along the front line, inspecting his men one final time. He spoke briefly to several of the senior commanders, men he had fought beside for decades. Then he took his place at the very center of the first line, at the point of the spear. The King of Poland would personally lead the charge. This was not bravado or foolishness. In the culture of the Polish warrior nobility, a leader who asked his men to risk death while he remained safely behind would lose all respect and authority. Sobieski had always led from the front, and he would not change now, not in the most important battle of his life. A priest rode forward and blessed the assembled cavalry, calling upon the Lord God to grant them victory over the infidel. The horsemen crossed themselves and murmured prayers. Many of them believed, deeply and sincerely, that they were fighting a holy war, that God would guide their lances and protect them from harm. Whether this belief was justified is a matter of theology, but its psychological effect was undeniable. These men rode into battle with absolute conviction that their cause was righteous and that divine providence favored them. Such conviction makes warriors extraordinarily brave and determined. Sobieski raised his sword high. Along the line, 18,000 horsemen tensed. Their horses, war-trained and sensing the impending action, began to paw the ground and toss their heads. Then Sobieski lowered his sword, pointing it directly at the Ottoman lines below, and the charge began. The first line moved forward at a walk, maintaining perfect formation. The sound of 60,000 hooves, even at a walk, was like distant thunder. As the slope steepened, the pace increased to a trot. The formation remained intact, each rider maintaining exact spacing with his neighbors, the line stretching across nearly a mile of front. The wings on their backs began to whistle softly as air flowed through the feathers. Then, as the slope grew steeper still, and gravity began to pull at horses and riders, the trot became a canter. The thunder grew louder, the whistle became a roar, an eerie, unnatural sound unlike anything else in nature. And then, with perhaps 400 meters still to go, Sobieski screamed the order to gallop. 3,000 winged Hussars surged forward as one, accelerating to full speed. The perfectly maintained formation began to bow slightly as horses in the center on steeper ground moved faster than those on the flanks, creating a crescent shape with the center ahead. This was deliberate, a refinement developed over decades of Polish cavalry tactics. The bowed formation would strike the enemy line at the center first, punching a hole, and then the flanks would wrap around, widening the breach. The noise was now overwhelming. The thunder of hooves merged with the roar of the wings, the shouting of riders and the jangling of armor and harness into a wall of sound that could be heard for miles. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. On the Ottoman left flank, soldiers looked up at the approaching avalanche and felt their courage fail. These were not cowards. Many were veterans who had fought in numerous campaigns. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. The sheer visual and auditory assault was overwhelming. The horsemen seemed impossibly tall, impossibly numerous, impossibly fast. The inhuman roaring of the wings suggested demons or jinn rather than mortal men.
Some Ottoman soldiers turned and ran without even attempting to fight. Others stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Only a few, the bravest or most disciplined, leveled their muskets and spears and prepared to meet the charge. They never had a chance. The first line of Hussars struck the Ottoman formations like a meteor impacting the earth. The 6-meter lances, propelled by the speed of galloping horses, augmented by gravity, punched through shields, through armor, through human bodies as if they were paper. A single lance thrust could impale 2 or even 3 men, the hollow wooden shaft sliding through bodies until it hit bone or armor thick enough to stop it, and then the hussar would wrench the lance free and thrust again. Horses weighing 500 kilograms, armored and moving at 40 kilometers per hour, crashed into infantry formations and simply trampled them. Men disappeared beneath the hooves, crushed into the earth. But the hussars did not stop. This was the critical difference between them and traditional cavalry. Most cavalry would charge, hit the enemy line, and then become bogged down in close combat, losing momentum and becoming vulnerable. The hussars had perfected the technique of maintaining momentum. The first line punched through the Ottoman formations, lances thrusting left and right, creating a corridor of destruction. And before the Ottomans could close that corridor, the second wave of Polish cavalry hammered into them. This wave widened the breach, pushing the broken Ottoman units further apart. And then came the third wave and the fourth. Within 10 minutes, the entire Ottoman left flank had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or dying. Thousands more were fleeing in panic. The cavalry formations that had been positioned there were scattered, riders fleeing in all directions. The artillery, caught before it could be brought into action, was overrun, the gun crews cut down where they stood. And the Polish hussars, having annihilated everything in their immediate path, did not stop to rest or regroup. Instead, they wheeled inward toward the Ottoman center. Kara Mustafa, watching from his command post, saw his left flank evaporate and felt the first cold touch of real fear. He immediately dispatched couriers, ordering his reserves to move left to plug the gap before the Polish cavalry could penetrate deeper. But it was too late. The reserves had been committed to the center and were already engaged. There was nothing available to stop the hussars. Meanwhile, the German and Austrian forces in the center, seeing the Ottoman flank collapse, redoubled their attacks. The pressure on the Ottoman center intensified unbearably. The Polish cavalry crashed into the Ottoman center from the flank and rear, a direction from which the Ottoman infantry had no defense. Janissaries who had been fighting stubbornly against the Germans in front of them suddenly found themselves being cut down from behind by Polish sabers. Sipahi cavalry units tried to form up to counter the Polish horsemen, but were overwhelmed before they could organize. The wave tactics that made the hussars so deadly now paid full dividends. Wave after wave of Polish cavalry hammered into the Ottoman formations, each impact driving deeper, spreading chaos and panic. The Ottoman center, which had held firm all day, began to crack. Units that had fought bravely for hours suddenly broke and ran. The crack became a fracture, and the fracture became a complete collapse. Within an hour of the initial cavalry charge, the entire Ottoman army was en route. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled toward the Danube River or toward the roads leading east. Officers tried to rally their men, but were ignored or trampled by the fleeing mob. The organized, disciplined army that had besieged Vienna for 2 months dissolved into a panicked mass of fugitives. Kara Mustafa attempted to organize a fighting retreat, but it was hopeless. His communications had broken down, his command structure had evaporated.
Individual units fought bravely in isolated pockets, selling their lives dearly to cover the retreat of their comrades, but these were drops in the ocean of defeat. The Grand Vizier, seeing that all was lost, abandoned his luxurious headquarters and fled east with a small bodyguard, leaving behind his personal treasures, his harem, and his dignity. The Christian forces pursued relentlessly. The cavalry, particularly the Poles, rode through the fleeing Ottomans like reapers through wheat, cutting down anyone who could not escape fast enough. The German and Austrian infantry, exhausted from a day of brutal combat, nevertheless found the energy to advance into the abandoned Ottoman camp. What they found there amazed them. The Ottoman siege camp was a city of tents containing treasures beyond imagination.
Kara Mustafa, in his arrogance, had brought with him an enormous amount of wealth. There were chests of gold and silver coins. There were silks and carpets from Persia. There were jeweled weapons, ornate armor, precious manuscripts, and religious artifacts plundered from churches across Hungary. There were hundreds of camels and horses. There was the Grand Vizier's personal menagerie, including exotic animals from Africa and Asia. And there was food. Glorious food, warehouses full of grain, dried fruits, honey, spices, and coffee. The starving defenders of Vienna, who had been reduced to eating rats and leather during the siege, poured out of the city and joined in the plunder. For 3 days, Vienna and the surrounding area descended into an orgy of looting. Soldiers and civilians alike seized whatever they could carry. Fights broke out over particularly valuable items. Some men became fabulously wealthy overnight. Others drank themselves to death on captured Ottoman wine, which the Muslim soldiers had kept for medicinal purposes, but which the Christian victors consumed enthusiastically. But amidst the celebration and plunder, the true scale of the victory became apparent. Approximately 15,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead on the battlefield itself. Thousands more had drowned trying to cross the Danube. Thousands more were cut down during the pursuit over the following days. Of the nearly 200,000 men who had marched on Vienna, perhaps only 100,000 made it back to Ottoman territory, and many of those were wounded, demoralized, or sick. The entire artillery train, 300 guns representing decades of military investment, was captured. The Ottomans had not merely lost a battle, they had lost an entire army. The consequences rippled outward from Vienna like waves from a stone dropped in a pond. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was catastrophic on multiple levels. Militarily, they had lost their finest troops and most experienced commanders. The Janissary Corps, which had been the backbone of Ottoman military power for 2 centuries, had been decimated. It would take years to rebuild the army, and even then, the new troops would lack the experience and esprit de corps of those lost at Vienna. Psychologically, the defeat shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility. For 2 centuries, European armies had feared the Ottomans as nearly unbeatable warriors. That myth was now destroyed. European states that had paid tribute to the Sultan out of fear would now find the courage to resist. Politically, the defeat triggered turmoil within the Ottoman government. Kara Mustafa fled back to Constantinople, where he faced the Sultan's wrath. On December 25, 1683, on the Sultan's orders, Kara Mustafa was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method of executing high-ranking Ottomans. His head was cut off and presented to the Sultan, while his body was left unburied as a mark of disgrace. But killing the Grand Vizier did not solve the Ottoman Empire's problems. The defeat had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Ottoman military and political system. In the years following Vienna, those weaknesses would be ruthlessly exploited. The Habsburgs, energized by their victory, launched a counteroffensive that would continue for 16 years. This Great Turkish War, as it came to be known, saw the Ottomans driven out of Hungary, a territory they had controlled for nearly a century and a half. At the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans were forced to cede Hungary, Transylvania, and large parts of Croatia and Slavonia to the Habsburgs. It was the first time the Ottoman Empire had signed a peace treaty that involved territorial losses, marking the beginning of a long decline that would continue for more than 2 centuries until the empire's final dissolution after World War I. For the Habsburg Empire, Vienna marked the beginning of a golden age. Emperor Leopold, who had fled Vienna in apparent cowardice, returned in triumph. The city that had been under existential threat became the shining capital of a resurgent empire. With the Ottoman threat removed, the Habsburgs could consolidate their control over Central Europe and project power into the Balkans. The magnificent Baroque palaces and churches that make Vienna one of Europe's most beautiful cities today were largely built in the century following the battle, financed by the wealth flowing from newly conquered territories and the confidence that came from having survived the ultimate test. For Poland, however, the aftermath of Vienna was bittersweet. John Sobieski returned to Poland as the hero of Christendom. Pope Innocent XI hailed him as the savior of Christian civilization. Poets composed epic verses celebrating his deeds. Artists painted dramatic canvases showing the charge of the winged Hussars. But Poland as a state gained remarkably little from the victory.
Despite providing the decisive force that won the battle, Poland received almost no territorial compensation. The Habsburgs took Hungary. Russia would later take territory from the weakening Ottoman Empire. Poland got nothing. Moreover, the Vienna campaign had exhausted Poland's resources. Raising, equipping, and marching 18,000 cavalry to Vienna, then sustaining them through the campaign, had cost the Polish treasury dearly. And the fractious Polish political system, with its liberum veto that allowed any single noble to block legislation, prevented effective reform or consolidation of royal power. In the decades following Sobieski's death in 1696, Poland grew progressively weaker. Its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, grew stronger. Eventually, in a series of partitions between 1772 and 1795, these 3 powers simply divided Poland among themselves, erasing it from the map for 123 years. The winged Hussars who had saved Vienna could not save their own country. For the winged Hussars themselves, Vienna represented both their greatest triumph and their swan song. The charge of September 12, 1683 was the largest and most successful heavy cavalry charge in history. Nothing before or since has matched it for scale, coordination, and devastating effect. But it was also one of the last times that heavy cavalry would play a decisive role in European warfare. The world was changing. Firearms were becoming more reliable and more powerful. Infantry tactics were evolving to counter cavalry charges through improved formations and firepower. Within a few decades, cavalry would be reduced primarily to reconnaissance, pursuit, and flank protection roles. The era of the armored knight, which had dominated European warfare for 1,000 years, was ending. The winged Hussars continued to exist as a military formation for another century, but they never again achieved anything comparable to Vienna. Gradually, their distinctive armor and wings disappeared, replaced by lighter equipment more suited to skirmishing and reconnaissance. By the late 18th century, when Poland itself disappeared from the map, the winged Hussars had already faded into legend. But what a legend it was, and what a legacy they left. The Battle of Vienna offers lessons that transcend its specific historical context and remain relevant today. First, it demonstrates the critical importance of alliance and cooperation in the face of existential threats. Europe in 1683 was deeply divided. Catholics and Protestants had slaughtered each other for over a century. France and the Habsburgs were mortal enemies. The German princes fought constantly among themselves. But when faced with the Ottoman threat, these divisions were temporarily overcome. Poles, Germans, Austrians, and Italians fought side by side and achieved together what none could have accomplished alone. In our own fragmented world, this lesson about the power of unity against common threats remains profoundly relevant.
Second, the battle illustrates the importance of leadership at critical moments. John Sobieski was more than just a competent general. He was an inspirational leader who led from the front, sharing the same dangers as his humblest soldier. This kind of leadership by example is rare and precious. It creates loyalty and courage that no amount of commands or speeches can match. In any human endeavor, whether military, political, or organizational, leadership that demonstrates rather than merely directs will always be more effective. Third, Vienna demonstrates that specialized capabilities, properly employed, can have effects vastly disproportionate to their size. The winged Hussars were a relatively small force, 3,000 men in an army of 70,000, but they were supremely specialized for a specific role: shock cavalry attack on favorable terrain. When Sobieski found exactly the right terrain at exactly the right moment and employed his specialized weapon with perfect timing, those 3,000 men destroyed an army of 200,000. This principle applies far beyond military affairs. In business, in technology, in any competitive field, specialized excellence strategically applied beats generic competence every time. Fourth, the battle teaches us about the decisive importance of timing. Sobieski held his cavalry in reserve for hours while the battle raged, resisting pressure from his subordinates to commit them earlier. He waited until the moment was exactly right, when the enemy was fully committed, when the terrain was perfect, when the sun would blind the defenders as they looked up at the charge. Everything had to align perfectly, and Sobieski had the judgment to recognize that moment when it came. In our own lives and endeavors, knowing when to act is often more important than knowing how to act. Finally, Vienna reminds us that history is not predetermined by abstract forces or inevitable trends. It is shaped by the choices and actions of real people in specific moments.
If Sobieski had not answered the call for help, if the German princes had not overcome their suspicions of Catholic Austria, if Starhemberg had surrendered the city even a few days earlier, history would have been completely different. Vienna would have fallen. The Ottoman Empire would have consolidated control over Central Europe, and the entire subsequent development of European civilization would have followed a different path. Today, if you visit Vienna, you can still find traces of that September day that changed history. The walls that Starhemberg defended are gone, replaced by the Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that circles the historic center. But plaques mark where the fortifications once stood. Museums house artifacts from the battle: Ottoman cannons, Hussar armor, swords and lances that drank blood 3.5 centuries ago. And on Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski and his Hussars began their immortal charge, stands a church dedicated to the memory of the battle. From its terrace, you can look down and trace the path of the charge, from the heights to the plains below. If you stand there and use your imagination, you can almost hear it: the thunder of 60,000 hooves shaking the earth, the eerie roar of wings creating their terrifying symphony, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of wounded horses and dying men. And if you listen very carefully, you might hear something else too: the sound of history changing direction, of an empire's dreams dying, of a civilization being saved by the courage of men willing to risk everything for what they believed in. The winged Hussars of Poland rode into immortality on that September afternoon. Their charge destroyed not just an army, but an empire's ambitions. They saved not just a city, but a civilization. And they proved that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, courage, skill, and leadership can achieve the impossible. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman army at Vienna was not just equipment or tactics. It was the human spirit, refined and tempered by generations of warfare, employed with brilliant strategy, and animated by absolute conviction in the righteousness of the cause. More than 3 centuries later, the charge of the winged Hussars remains one of the most spectacular military achievements in human history. A moment when everything was at stake, when the future hung in the balance, and when ordinary men, through extraordinary courage and skill, changed the world forever. If you found this story of courage, strategy, and the cavalry charge that saved Europe compelling. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss future deep dives into the most pivotal battles in human history. Leave a comment below telling us what moment from the Battle of Vienna affected you most. Was it Starhemberg's desperate defense, Sobieski's brilliant timing, the terrifying charge of the winged Hussars? And if you want to support this kind of in-depth historical content, please like this video and share it with anyone who loves real stories of courage and military genius. History is not just dates and facts. It's the story of human beings making impossible choices in impossible situations. And sometimes, just sometimes, they win. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.